ABC General Hospital spoilers for Thursday. February 19 revealed that Rick could feel the weight of the secret pressing against his ribs, as if every breath carried the threat of exposing what he had kept buried far too long. For years he had danced in the shadows of Port Charles, pulling strings, sabotaging alliances, and testing the limits of the Corinthos family's patience. But now, in a twist few could have predicted, he found himself standing on the edge of a truth so explosive that even the most hardened residents of the town would be left stunned. The revelation he was preparing to drop, the one he had guarded like a loaded weapon, promised to upend everything. They thought they knew about Sonny Corinthos, the danger surrounding him, and the fragile alliances forming in the dark corners of the city. What Sonny didn't know, or perhaps had only begun to suspect, was that the threats gathering around him were no longer external enemies moving like soldiers across a chessboard. The danger had changed shape. It had become something more sophisticated, more insidious, woven into financial networks, political leverage, and alliances built behind closed doors by people Sonny didn't even know existed. Rick, in his years drifting between law and criminality, had seen the rise of a new power, one uninterested in the old rules that had governed Port Charles for decades. He had tried to keep his distance, but the truth was unavoidable. Sonny was no longer dealing with rivals. He was dealing with a force that wanted to erase him entirely. It should have been easy for Rick to let that happen. Too easy. After everything between them, crossing his arms and watching Sonny fall would have felt in another lifetime, like poetic justice. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the recognition that once Sonny fell, everyone connected to him would be dragged into the wreckage. Christina, Molly, even the fragile piece that held the town together. Maybe it was Rick's own survival instinct, realizing that the new threat didn't differentiate between Corinthos and Lansing, that once they were done with Sonny, Rick would be next. Or maybe in the quiet corners of his conscience, Rick simply understood that the man he once hated was the only person with enough power to stand beside him against what was coming. Thus began the strange, unnerving cooperation between Sonny and Rick. It started with shared information exchanged reluctantly. Then came strategy meetings that lasted into the night, Sonny pacing across the room while Rick laid out maps, documents, and coded messages. The tension between them was thick enough to choke on, built from decades of betrayal and resentment. But the urgency of the danger forced them into a rhythm neither expected. For the first time, Rick wasn't working against Sonny, he was working to keep him alive. But what made their alliance truly dangerous was the secret Rick had not yet revealed. The one he kept locked behind his careful expressions and controlled voice. This was the truth that would make jaws drop. The truth that would finally force Sonny to confront just how deep the enemy's reach had grown. It wasn't just that Sonny was being targeted, it was who was orchestrating the attack and why. Rick had stumbled upon documents linking a silent benefactor to multiple criminal enterprises, political movements, and offshore accounts. At first he thought it was another cartel or rogue family attempting to rise in power. But the deeper he dug, the clearer it became this was someone Sonny had once trusted. Someone whose smiling presence had become part of the background of Port Charles. Someone no one would ever suspect. Rick knew that dropping this truth would either cement his unstable alliance with Sonny or destroy it in an instant. Because once Sonny learned that the danger clawing at him came from inside his own circle, his world would fracture. Loyalties would crumble. Relationships would implode. And Sonny himself, already worn down by years of violence and betrayal, might not withstand the weight of this new treachery. Yet Rick also knew that without this reveal, Sonny wouldn't truly understand the magnitude of the storm approaching. The adjustments Sonny had begun making, tightening security, rearranging his organization, pulling his family closer, were not enough. He was preparing for a traditional enemy, one he could threaten or outwit. But this new threat moved differently, fought differently, struck differently. And Rick, burdened with knowledge, would soon have no choice but to shatter the illusion Sonny still clung to. When the moment comes when Rick finally opens his mouth and lets the truth spill into the room, it will not just be a revelation. It will be an earthquake. It will mark the beginning of an entirely new era of danger in Port Charles. One that forces Sonny and Rick into an uneasy partnership neither of them ever imagined but both now desperately need. And once the truth escapes, there will be no turning back. Alexis delivered one of her trademark razor-sharp observations, the kind that sliced straight through pretense and exposed the truth no one else dared to articulate. It emerged not in anger but in the cool, the measured tone she used when she was already 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. And in that moment, the entire direction of her life and Willow's shifted. Because Alexis had finally identified the opportunity she'd been waiting for. The narrow but undeniable opening to reclaim custody of Scout. And once Alexis Davis sensed an opening, she became a force of nature that no one, not even a rising political figure like Willow, could easily stop. For weeks, Alexis had watched Willow's ascent into power with growing suspicion. What others saw as impressive, Alexis saw as careless. What others admired as decisiveness, she recognized as dangerous overreach. Willow was too new, too raw, too unprepared for the political world she was stepping into. And the cracks in her judgment were beginning to show. Alexis noticed details others dismissed: Willow's tightening control over personal relationships, her increasingly rigid decisions, her inability to separate political ambition from emotional insecurity. And every one of those cracks was a potential weapon, a point Alexis could use to her advantage. The motivation was simple, visceral, and fiercely maternal. Scout deserved stability, safety, a home free from the psychological turbulence that had begun spreading through Port Charles like smoke. Willow, intoxicated by new power and manipulated by Sidwell's quiet influence, was spiraling into decisions that touched not only national policy, but personal lives. Alexis saw it clearly: the way Willow's authority distorted her sense of boundaries, the way she inserted control into places where compassion once lived. And Alexis realized something explosive: she could use Willow's ambition against her. When Alexis made her cutting remark, the one that left the room frozen for a heartbeat, it wasn't just commentary, it was strategy. It was her acknowledging out loud that Willow's behavior was no longer simply concerning, it was actionable. It created precedent. It created leverage. And leverage, when placed in Alexis Davis's hands, always led to war. She understood that the chaotic adjustments in Willow's public and private life were forming the perfect foundation for a custody challenge. Judges hated instability. They hated leaders who blurred professional authority with personal relationships. And Willow was doing both with alarming speed. Alexis knew that if she collected the right evidence, documented the right interventions, and presented Scout's need for emotional stability alongside Willow's escalating control issues, the court would have no choice but to reconsider custody. It would be the kind of devastating blow Willow never expected, because she believed her newfound power extended everywhere. She forgot that in family court, humility mattered more than authority. But Alexis didn't stop there. She recognized that this wasn't just a custody battle. This was the beginning of Willow's unraveling politically and personally. A senator who couldn't manage her home life, who mishandled emotional conflicts, who exerted inappropriate influence over minors, that was a scandal waiting to ignite. And Alexis, with her legal expertise and unwavering composure, they was prepared to strike exactly where it hurt most: Willow's credibility. Word began to spread. Conversations shifted behind closed doors. Questions surfaced about Willow's fitness as both a guardian and a political figure. Whispered doubts snowballed into open speculation. Port Charles felt it: the shift in power, the scent of coming conflict. This was no longer a simple disagreement between two women. It was the beginning of a political and personal explosion that would redefine alliances across the entire town. And the astonishing part: Willow still didn't see it coming. She believed she controlled the narrative. She believed her new authority protected her. But Alexis knew the truth. The higher Willow climbed, the harder she would fall, because her foundation was already cracking beneath her feet. Scout's custody battle would be the first fracture. Public doubt would be the second. And once the first domino fell, everything Willow built, her influence, her reputation, her identity, would begin to collapse. Alexis didn't simply deliver a sharp remark. She ignited the fuse of a war that would expose Willow's darkest vulnerabilities, reshape power in Port Charles, and determine the future of Scout, all while proving that when Alexis Davis smelled opportunity, nothing could stand in her way. The people who loved Maxie gathered around her with a mixture of relief, hope, and unspoken fear. After everything she had endured, seeing her awake, breathing, and present felt like witnessing a miracle unravel in slow motion. Hands touched her shoulders, voices softened around her, and the hospital room, once sterile and cold, filled with warmth that only family could create. But even in this fragile joy, tension threaded quietly through the space, because everyone knew that Maxie's return did not simply mark recovery. It marked the reopening of wounds, questions, and secrets that had been held back for far too long. Liesl Obrecht, perhaps the most expressive of them all, stood beside Maxie with a determination that could bend fate itself. Her eyes shone with fierce devotion as she watched Nathan hover awkwardly near the bed, torn between overwhelming love and paralyzing guilt. Liesl had made up her mind: Maxie and Nathan belonged together. Too many forces had pulled them apart, too many sacrifices had been made, and she refused to let life keep them separated, when destiny clearly willed otherwise. To Liesl, the reconciliation was not merely romantic, it was justice. A correction of every wrong turn that had broken Maxie's heart. She wanted her son to fight to reclaim what he had lost, to rewrite the pain that had haunted both of them. And she believed Maxie waking up was the sign the universe had been waiting for. But as Liesl pushed gently, insisting Nathan not let fear destroy the second chance, another presence in the room observed the reunion with a wary, unsettled heart. Felicia. Unlike the others, she felt something beneath the surface, something she could not yet name. Something that tugged at her instincts with the quiet persistence of a cold draft slipping through a closed window. Felicia had always trusted her intuition, and now that intuition whispered that the man standing before Maxie, the one offering hesitant smiles and carefully measured words, was not exactly who he appeared to be. Her suspicion began as a flicker days earlier, a moment when Nathan's reaction to a piece of family history felt off. Not wrong exactly, but misaligned. Details he should have known. Stories he should have recognized. Emotional cues that should have surfaced but didn't. At first, Felicia dismissed it as stress. After all, trauma reshapes memory. And Nathan had been through enough turmoil to confuse anyone. But the more she observed him, the more she noticed patterns. Hesitations. Slips. A rehearsed quality to his explanations. A distance in his eyes when certain questions arose. And now, watching him interact with Maxie, Felicia's doubt grew sharper, slicing through the celebration with a chilling undercurrent. What if Nathan wasn't simply lost? What if he wasn't just overwhelmed? What if the man they believed was Nathan? West was hiding a truth far darker. Felicia kept her suspicions to herself for now. This was Maxie's moment, her fragile rebirth, and Felicia refused to tarnish it with fear. But inside, her mind raced. If her intuition was right, then Maxie's return to life might usher in a new constituent. Dangerous chapter none of them were prepared for. Liesel's insistence on reuniting Nathan and Maxie, though filled with good intentions, might be pushing Maxie towards someone whose identity was not as solid as everyone believed. Meanwhile, Nathan felt the weight of Felicia's eyes. He sensed her hesitation, the subtle tension radiating from her whenever he approached Maxie. It triggered something deep inside him, a pulse of anxiety, almost shame, and he scrambled to appear calm, stable, familiar. But the truth was harder to conceal with every passing hour. And Felicia, sharp as a blade, noticed everything. The adjustments already beginning, the shifting dynamics, the uneasy glances, the quiet reshuffling of trust created a delicate but volatile atmosphere. Maxie's return should have brought unity, but instead, it illuminated cracks in the room that none of them had realized were there. Liesel pushed for love. Felicia questioned identity. Nathan struggled to maintain whatever fragile mask he wore. And Maxie, still weak, still reawakening to the world, sensed only that something important was being left unsaid. Her loved ones celebrated. But beneath the joy was a trembling question. Who exactly had they welcomed back into Maxie's life and the moment? The truth surfaced, whatever it was. The shock would ripple through every relationship in that room, reshaping the future in ways none of them were ready to face. Willow moved through the house with a quiet intensity that Drew had only seen a handful of times before, the kind of controlled, simmering determination that meant a storm was forming behind her calm expression. She had rehearsed her words 1,000 times in her head, but nothing could soften the gravity of what she was about to tell him. This wasn't just a conversation between husband and wife. This was a declaration, a warning, and a turning point all at once. Drew sensed it the moment she stepped into the room, her posture straight, her voice steady. Her eyes filled with a resolve that made the air feel heavier. She told Drew she had something important to say, and the significance of those words hit him in the chest long before she revealed the truth. The tone alone carried weight, urgency, and a kind of sharpened authority that didn't used to live inside her. Willow had changed. The political world had pulled her inward, reshaped her priorities, honed her ambition into something fierce and unyielding. And now, with her campaign for the Senate accelerating, she was no longer willing to let anything or anyone stand in her way. The threat she delivered was not overtly cruel, but it was deeply chilling in its clarity. She needed Drew's unwavering support, and she expected him to fall in line. She framed it as unity, as partnership, as shared purpose, but Drew heard the subtext. Willow was telling him that she would not allow cracks in their personal life to weaken her ascent to political power. His hesitations, his moral questions, his discomfort with how far she was willing to go, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was victory. What mattered was control. What mattered was the unstoppable image she intended to project. And if he resisted, he would become her obstacle. Drew stared at her, stunned by how much she had transformed. He knew the ambition inside her had been growing, but he never imagined she would turn it into a weapon, especially against him. Meanwhile, Michael found himself trapped in one of the most precarious positions of his life. He had always been caught between family dynamics, secrets, and loyalties. But Willow's political uprising had thrust him into a crisis that felt more personal and more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. Willow's decisions, once rooted in compassion and moral clarity, were now driven by the hunger for authority. And as she rose higher, her view of Michael shifted. No longer was he her trusted ally. Now he was someone who could be molded, manipulated, even overpowered if necessary. Michael felt the pressure closing in on him like a tightening rope. He couldn't support Willow's extremist direction, not when it threatened his family, not when it chipped away at the mother his children depended on. But opposing her meant risking everything: his relationships, his custody, stability, his public reputation. Willow had already shown she was willing to use personal leverage to enforce her ambitions. If she could pressure Drew, the man she loved, what would she be willing to do to Michael? A man whose choices could directly derail her Senate climb, and so he hesitated. He stayed quiet. He tried to navigate the rising tension, but the more Willow sensed his discomfort, the more aggressive her posture became. Her rise to power demanded a narrative of strength and unity. Michael's doubts were a threat to that narrative, and threats were something she was prepared to crush. What no one expected was how swiftly Willow escalated. The political fight transformed into a family war, one where alliances began shifting under the surface. Michael was no longer simply disagreeing with Willow. He was becoming her opponent, her challenger, her obstacle. And the moment Willow recognized this, something inside her hardened. If Michael intended to stand in her way, she would fight him not as family, not as a mother. Not as someone who once shared vulnerability with him, but as a political adversary. The shockwave rippled through Port Charles long before their conflict even became public. People who sensed the tension understood that this was only the beginning. Willow was climbing toward power with a fire so intense it burned through everything gentle she once embodied. Drew was shaken. Michael was cornered. And whatever came next would not simply shift their lives, it would reshape the political, emotional, and moral landscape of Port Charles. Because Willow was no longer fighting for something. She was fighting against anyone who dared stand in her path. And Michael unwillingly, tragically, had just become her first battlefield.